On Tuesday, Vice President Harris visited Ghana's Cape Coast slave castle and wiped away tears as she toured through the dungeons. She said the experience proved how important it is to teach and preserve the history of those who were held as slaves. The door of no return, which is known as the last step before people who were enslaved were dragged onto ships and carried across the Atlantic Ocean, was passed through by Harris and a second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, during their hour-long visit to the location. Welcome. This is Rain Smith, and you're watching the New Africa channel. Even as she stood earlier on Tuesday in front of a monument honoring Ghana's independence and imagined a glorious future between the U.S. and Africa driven by the creativity on a continent, Harris insisted on recalling the sad past during her visit to Cape Coast Castle. She remarked from the fort as the sun was setting over the ocean, "The horror of what happened here must always be remembered. It cannot be denied. It must be taught. History must be learned." Harris strayed from her keynote speech to speak candidly about the pain and grief that reeks from the Cape Coast Castle and the horrors endured by those who passed through those walls, including mass kidnapping, sickness, rape, and death. In the Americas, those who survived were sold into slavery. And yet, they survived, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. She said the endurance and determination of the African diaspora in the world should be admired. All of us, regardless of our background, have benefited from their fight for freedom and justice, she said.
So being here was immensely powerful and moving. When we think about how human beings were treated by the hundreds of thousands in this very place that we now stand, the crimes that happened here, the blood that was shed here, there are dungeons here where human beings were kept, men, women, and children. They were kidnapped from their homes. They were transported hundreds of miles from their homes, not really sure where they were headed, and they came to this place of horror. Some to die, many to starve and be tortured, women to be raped before they were then forcibly taken on a journey thousands of miles from their home to be sold by so-called merchants and taken to the Americas, to the Caribbean, to be an enslaved people. We don't know the numbers who died on their way to this place, the numbers who were killed during that passage on the Atlantic. The horror of what happened here must always be remembered. It cannot be denied. It must be taught. History must be learned. And we must then be guided by what we know also to be the history of those who survived in the Americas, in the Caribbean, those who proudly declare themselves to be the diaspora, who then came out of in often many situations, odds that were designed to break them, to demoralize them, to create systems and situations that were to make them feel like less than humans, less than full human beings. But yet they survived. And they tell another history, a history of endurance, a history of faith, a history in believing what is possible, a history not only that tells about the ability that each individual has to survive, but to thrive. And so all these stories must be told. All these stories must be told in a way that we take from this place the pain we all feel, the anguish that reeks from this place. And we then carry the knowledge that we have gained here toward the work that we do in lifting up all people, in recognizing the struggles of all people, of fighting for, as the walls of this place talk about, justice and freedom for all people, human rights for all people. So that's what I take from being here. The descendants of the people who walked through that door were strong people, proud people, people of deep faith, people who loved their families, their traditions, their culture, and carried that innate being with them through all of these periods. Went on to fight for civil rights, fight for justice in the United States of America and around the world. And all of us, regardless of your background, have benefited from their struggle and their fight for freedom and for justice. Thank you.
Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff, during their tour came across a plaque honoring Barack and Michelle Obama, the country's first black president and first lady who had visited the area. The couple strolled alongside the cannon-lined stone ramparts, stopping sometimes to take in the view of the ocean and the breaking waves below. As she moved through the white archways and along the shadowy path that led through the famed Door of No Return, which slaves were said to have used to leave the coast and never return, Harris approached with her palm on her mouth as she fought back tears. She laid a white flower bouquet presented to her during the arrival ceremony at the entry to a nearby women's dungeon. Cape Coast Castle is one of dozens of slave-holding fortresses in West Africa, many of which are in Ghana. The government has viewed their preservation as part of its historical responsibility. The vice president, according to tour guide Kwesi Blankson, was told about how prisoners occasionally looked up through the openings in the dungeon ceiling and prayed to the gods and sang hymns. One of the songs he performed for her was about wanting to die, because death meant freedom. Interestingly, Kwesi Blankson compared the tour to being at a graveyard since everything was so solemn. The vice president declared that she intended to use the grief and sorrow she experienced at Cape Coast Castle to fight for liberty and justice. She pointed out that people who were once slaves later fought for civil rights in the United States and throughout the globe. As the United States expands its engagement with the continent, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who is also the country's first Black and South Asian leader, is the most prominent official of the Biden administration to travel to Africa. She will travel for a week, stopping in Tanzania and Zambia in addition to her activities in Ghana. So, what do you think of our video? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the New Africa channel for your daily news feed.